It all started with a United Nations partition plan of Palestine in 1947. There was supposed to be one Jewish state and one Palestinian Arab state. Almost 7 decades later, it still hasn't happened. To help us understand the depth of the problem, we welcome in Jerusalem, Israel via Skype, Bernard Avishai, professor of business at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. In Washington, D.C. via Skype, Hussein Ibish, senior fellow with the American Task Force on Palestine. And with us here in our studio, Yasmin Habib, political science professor at the University of Waterloo. And Yasmin, your name is spelled with a J, right, pronounced Yasmin, so I want to do that. And I also want to, no disrespect to our guests out of town, but we've had a blizzard here in the last 24 hours. Right. And you took 3.5 hours to get to our studio today for what is normally an hour drive. So thank you so much for making that extra effort to do so.
Very welcome.
Bernard Avishai, let me start with you. I want to get your interpretation of some of the following numbers that were in yesterday's edition of Haaretz newspaper. Apparently a poll showing 63% of Israelis favoring peace talks between Israelis and Palestinians. 70% don't think the negotiations will actually lead to peace. Among Israeli Arabs, 90% want peace talks to happen, but 50% don't think that peace can be attained if those talks take place. What do those numbers say to you?
Well, this has been the pattern for really several years. I think they reflect two things. One, they reflect the despair, I think, that both Israelis and Palestinians feel regarding their own leaderships. I think most people recognize on both sides of the Green Line that the Netanyahu government is interested in speaking about a peace process more than participating seriously in one. But on the other hand, they also think that the Abbas government in Ramallah may wish more sincerely for peace talks to succeed, but don't really have the clout to make them happen. And then on top of everything else, you have the problem of scale. I mean, you have these two prospective city-states really together the size of Greater Los Angeles, or soon the size of Greater Toronto. And, you know, the idea that they can just be split into two separate territories where the Palestinians have responsibility for their terrorists and Israelis have responsibility for their fanatics, and that somehow these two sides can be kept apart without the whole thing crashing down on everybody's heads. I think this is starting to look to a lot of people as being somewhat impossible. So I think people do despair. They think that somehow the peace process needs to go on. Nobody wants to have a Bosnia here. But at the same time, I think they feel, you know, not with these leaders and not in this context, that, you know, can we really make a two-state solution work?
Hussein, what do you infer from the numbers?
Well, I think that's all correct. I also think what's really fascinating is that you get very similar numbers from the Palestinians. There was a poll a couple of weeks ago, didn't ask exactly the same question, but it asked Palestinians about their level of support for a two-state solution, and there was another solid majority in favor of it, but again, reiterated what Israelis also say. They want a two-state peace agreement, a two-state outcome, but they don't believe the other side is sincere. So you have this remarkable sort of double muteness and double deafness, if you will. On the one hand, they insist, both majorities on both sides insist they really do want a two-state outcome, but they don't believe the other side when they say they do. So, you know, it's kind of a remarkable mutual doubt that has settled in. I do think, though, one should take overall some satisfaction that even in this moment of despair that was, I think, rightly described, especially with an Israeli tinge by Professor Avishai, also very strongly on the Palestinian side. I mean, I haven't seen Palestinians this angry and this frustrated, this despairing in a couple of decades, if not longer, frankly. And it appears to them that there's no end to the occupation and no horizon, no mechanism for getting out of it, that even under such circumstances, there are still majorities that are willing to say that they're in favor of a two-state outcome. Imagine what the number would be if we had a more hopeful situation, if we had a dynamic one and one where people really thought this was a plausible outcome. I think the number would shoot way up.
Yasmin, one of the reasons we wanted you here today is because you've got kind of a foot in both camps on this one, don't you? Why don't you tell us a bit about your background for starters?
Sure. Okay. Well, I was born in Israel. My father's Palestinian, my mother is Jewish, and we came to Canada when I was a young child. I still have family in Israel, and the Palestinians on my side of the family actually live within the state of Israel rather than in the occupied territories.
How do you self-identify?
Both.
You do?
Yes.
Are you Jewish or Muslim?
No, my father's Christian, actually, so
Christian,
it's Greek
okay.
Orthodox.
Okay.
And so I wasn't raised either in either church or synagogue. My parents were actually communists, so secular upbringing entirely, and we just had wonderful meals depending on the holiday. And wonderful.
Embraced a little bit of everything.
That's right.
Gotcha. Okay. With that background now in place, the two-state solution.
Right.
Is it a solution?
Look, I think no one is against a two-state solution if it were to offer peoples on both sides of this divide civil rights, human rights, full rights, citizenship rights. It seems to me that the 1947 idea, which was a partition idea, has tragically failed, and it's failed certainly the Palestinians more so than the Jews, who continue to have a state, they have a military, they have protection. Palestinians remain either as second-class citizens or B-class citizens, or in the occupied territory, certainly they have no citizenship. They live under a predominantly military rule, and certainly refugees live in refugee camps. So it's a failed project, I would say.
A failed project, period, full stop.
Period, full stop.
Move on.
Well, move on. I think what we need to begin to think about or to talk about are civil and democratic rights and citizenship rights. And if we begin from that perspective, then one state, two state, I don't really care how many states. The point is to recognize the rights of peoples living in that territory, if you will.
We'll come back to that in a bit. Let's just put on the record here what the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, whom, as you know, has dissolved parliament, called for elections happening next March. Here's what he's had to say about this. Real peace will only come with leadership that demands from the Palestinians to accept the three pillars of peace. 1, genuine mutual recognition. 2, an end to all claims, including the right of return. And 3, a long-term Israeli security presence. Now, I will never give up on this triangle of true peace. Hussein, is there any reason to believe that that triangle could be the basis of any peace agreement?
Exclusively no, and particularly not the third item. I mean, the third item is explicitly holds that, as far as I can understand it, and as far as, you know, if we contextualize it in terms of other comments made by Prime Minister Netanyahu about where he was more specific about Israel not relinquishing security control in any territory west of the Jordan River. In other words, anywhere in the West Bank, basically. Now, that really is a killer of a two-state agreement. It won't be, in other words, a sovereign Palestinian state. It would be some sort of a mini-state with truncated rights and an Israeli security presence. That's a non-starter from a Palestinian point of view. Even though I think that there's something that's been sort of lacking here, which is the Israelis have failed to take advantage of the fact that they've had a PLO leadership on the other side for the past 10 years that hasn't wanted to create a military, that's been willing voluntarily to have a demilitarized state or non-militarized state, since they don't have a military. But that has not been taken up by the Israelis in any kind of serious way. What you've gotten instead is this increasing insistence that Israel cannot allow an independent Palestinian state with its own security forces to live alongside it, and that Israel has to retain security control. So that pillar 3, I think, is a killer for a two-state solution.
Bernard, let me ask you about one of the angles of the triangle as it relates to the Palestinian side of the equation, and that is the issue of refugees. In a recent interview with an Egyptian newspaper, Mahmoud Abbas, the head of the Palestinian Authority, objected to the idea of Israel as a Jewish state because he said this would prevent the return of Palestinian refugees, of which he said there were about 6 million. In other words, stateless people who would not be able to come home. In which case, what do we do about this angle of Netanyahu's triangle?
Well, but this is a little misleading. I mean, Abbas actually told me point blank that he understands that if 5 million Palestinians come back to Israel, that would destroy Israel as we know it. And he has no intention of pressing for the return of so many refugees. There have been many modalities that have been negotiated for the return of a certain number of refugees. And when he and Olmert got to rather advanced negotiations, which they shared with me in 2011, when they had these negotiations in 2008, 2009, they were really speaking about recognizing the refugee right of return in the context of the Arab League peace plan, recognizing UN Resolution 194, but nevertheless keeping vague whether all refugees could come back and allowing a symbolic return of refugees. So that I think, we ought not to kind of startle ourselves with bad, indications of bad faith here. The truth is, though, that like the security issue, the issue of refugees has to be seen in the scale of this problem. It's very hard when you have such a small scale. The distance from Ramallah to Jerusalem, or the distance from Nablus, which is the biggest city in the West Bank, to Herzliya, which is the sort of technology capital of Israel, that distance is about 22 miles. So think of it. It's like from Willowdale, or maybe, just a little above north of Steeles, down to the waterfront. We're not talking about a very big place. So how can Israel assume that the other side could have full responsibility for controlling terrorists who, if they had a shoulder-fired missile, could take down a plane whose glide path takes you over Palestinian territory? Right now you have something like 13 yeshivot, 13 houses of study facing Al-Aqsa Mosque, and 3 of them preach the rebuilding of the temple and taking down the Mosque of Omar. So, you can't really look at security here as if we're talking about, Poland on the one hand and say France on the other.
Okay, let me get Yasmin's.
Very small space.
Let me get Yasmin's take on this as well. I mean, the refugee issue sounds completely unsolvable. You can't be a Jewish state if you have 6 million Palestinian refugees come back and reclaim where they once lived. On the other hand, you have to deal with that issue somehow.
Right.
Where's the compromise?
Okay, so maybe we could begin from another point, actually. So if we were to assume that right now what we have is one state, it is just that in that one state we have Palestinians who do not have rights and we have Jews who do have rights. And we were to assume then that Palestinians could return, which I would say all refugees have a right to return. So from that perspective of international law, they have a right to return. It is true that under the current system, the Jewish state would be threatened as a Jewish state. However,
unquote.
Quote unquote, exactly. If we were to consider it as, if we were to think of this as a secular democratic state, if we were working towards a secular democratic state in which both Jews and Palestinians were represented through, say, binational federalism, other kinds of protections that could be put in place for minority perspectives, minority political rule, if you will, I think we have a starting point. When Bernard Avishai speaks about terrorism, he's only speaking from the perspective of Tel Aviv or Jerusalem. What of all of the Palestinians living not only in refugee camps, say in Lebanon, who are insecure, the Palestinians who are now coming out of Syria who are insecure? We're also talking about the West Bank and Gaza Palestinians who are entirely insecure. So security, even as a word or the language of security, seems only to be taken up or considered from the perspective of the from Tel Aviv or Jerusalem.
But let me follow up with this: if part of the reason that Israel was founded in the first place was to give the Jews of the world a safe place to live, coming out of the Holocaust and
Correct.
Thousands of years of persecution and so on,
Right.
how does your solution ensure a Jewish majority in Israel, which is presumably part of the package of keeping Jews there secure?
Well, I'm not sure that Jews are actually more secure in Israel than any other part of the world at this point. We had certainly at the point of post-war post-World War II period, we needed a safe space or a safe environment for the Jews to travel to, if you will, and a secure environment for them. That didn't have to mean that they would have to have a Jewish state. It could have been a binational state from the very beginning, from the get-go. Why displace 700,000 people? Why? That doesn't make any sense to me. It is embedded within this structure, this tragic sort of partition plan, a never-ending cycle, I think, of violence. You have Palestinians within the state, you have Palestinians outside the state, you have Jews outside the state as well, right? Not seeking to return necessarily, and that may well be true of Palestinians who may not seek a return.
Hussein, I was just going to ask, how do we respect the right of return for Palestinians who have been ousted from that part of the world, and at the same time respect the Jewish population's need to feel secure, quote unquote, in its own homeland?
Well, look, I think we need to maybe stop for a second dealing in abstractions and remind ourselves that outcomes are produced by the forces that produce outcomes. And those are social forces, political forces, military and economic forces. That's it. We can imagine an alternate reality in which it might be possible to persuade Jewish Israelis to dismantle their state after 100 years of building it through all of this effort and wars and whatnot on some moral principle or because they've lost a debate. But that's, in my view, just not going to happen. And so if we look at the situation in the occupied territories and say, well, it's ending it is a failed project because it's too difficult because Israel won't agree to end it, and therefore the corrective to that is to persuade Jewish Israelis to voluntarily dismantle their majoritarian state. I don't understand this logic at all. As far as refugees go, though, for sure there has to be a compromise. On the Israeli side, the hardest one will be about Jerusalem. On the Palestinian side, it will be about refugees. And the biggest group of refugees are in the occupied territories, so they would go immediately from being refugees to being citizens. And I think that there's a lot that a two-state solution offers refugees in, say, Syria and Lebanon that is better than what they've had since 1948, which is nothing. And I honestly think that they can either continue having the status quo of nothing into the foreseeable future, or they could benefit from what the emergence of a Palestinian state would offer them: a refuge, a home, a government to represent them, a passport they could access, etc. I mean, I think it's entirely possible to do an overall package deal for a two-state solution in which Palestinians do make that historic compromise. And I think most of the Palestinian negotiators who've been dealing with the Israelis since the past 20 years have understood that. And I think the Israelis also have to make some very painful, very difficult compromises, particularly on Jerusalem, where this eternal, undivided capital of the Jewish people is not a tenable outcome. But one of the reasons why we're dealing with these statements, like Netanyahu's statement that you quoted about security and all these three pillars, his demands, and Abbas's statement about refugees, which is a deviation from his previous efforts to kind of reach out to Israelis and reassure them in a roundabout way, saying he didn't want to return to his village, which is now part of Israel, is because in the absence of a dynamic process, these issues have now become internal political footballs for negotiating power within Jewish Israeli society and within Palestinian society. This is no longer part of a diplomatic game, it's part of a political game, and that's really unfortunate because it means people go back to their lowest common denominator and start playing to the base.
Well, let's quote, forgive me because I don't want the clock to get away from us here, and talking about one of the Jewish power players here, let's play a clip now from the leader of, I think, what's accurately described as the far-right Jewish Home Party in Israel. Here's Naftali Bennett. We'll play a clip, then we'll come back and chat. Roll tape, please.
I think that everyone in the region understands we're not going to reach peace agreements in the next 20 years. No one reasonable, right or left, thinks that that's in the cards anymore because it's just not working out, and because primarily there's this big radical Islamic wave that's pouring all over the region. ISIS in Iraq, Syria disintegrating, Egypt with the revolution and the counter-revolution. We're in a storm. And Israel is sort of a lighthouse in this storm, a lighthouse of democracy, of a good economy, a startup nation, but it's tough. And the way to stay in this very tough region is to be strong, not to concede land, but to be tough. There's no other way if you want to survive. Bernard Avishai,
I'm not sure there's any votes among our guests today for Naftali Bennett, but does his point that the conditions in the region right now are just too all over the place, that they just do not serve the cause of peace. Is he right about that?
Look, the big danger for not solving the Palestinian issue is Jordan. I think it's absurd for Bennett to look at all of the violence in the region and the fact that ISIS is on the borders of Jordan and dispute the idea that we have to solve the Palestinian question, because nothing is going to destabilize Jordan like a continuing bleeding wound on the other side of the river. So, yes, it's a dangerous place. No one is suggesting that the Israel Defense Forces disarm. And the question is not only whether you can be tough, the question is whether you know how to get along with people. And, you know, the world is not the high school where he thinks he learned every lesson he ever has to know. We have, I just want to come back to one point that Canadians, I think, should be particularly tuned to, and that's federation or confederation. I think that we spoke around this issue a few times, both on the issue of security and on the issue of refugees, but we haven't actually said the word. Yasmin kind of hinted at it, but I think we have to recognize that in order to make a two-state solution work in this small space, you have to have an extremely high level of cooperation on security, but not only on security, on water, on bandwidth, on disease control, on residency. I mean, if a Palestinian refugee goes to a Palestinian state rather than to the home in the Valley of Jezreel that he may have left, he would be 10-minute drive away. So there's no reason not to think about a world in which Palestinians are residents of Israel, perhaps, but citizens of Palestine. Israeli settlers may remain citizens of Israel, but residents of Palestine. It's not just a question of safety either when we talk about Israel today.
Fair enough.
It's two distinct cultural lives where two distinct peoples want to have what makes them distinct separate.
Right.
I mean, Canadians obviously understand this, and the kind of confederation that Israel and Palestine will inevitably get into in order to make a two-state solution work is going to be highly cooperative.
I think that's all true. I agree with all of that.
Yes, I don't disagree with that. I mean, this is partly what a binational state could look like. And that's why I said one state, two state. I don't know anyone who's opposed to a two-state solution if what it means are the rights of Palestinians are embedded within the confederation of either state, essentially. And it is true, there will need to be cooperation. So whether it's cooperation towards peace, two-state solution, one-state solution, binational state. The point is that right now we have a one-state solution, whether we want to admit it or not, and a continuing process that simply says, we're negotiating for peace, we're negotiating for peace. In the meantime, settlements expand, wars continue, Palestinians have no rights.
Everybody seems to see on the horizon, oh, that's where we want to go,
Yes.
but we can't get there from here. So let me quote Naftali Bennett one more time and then get you, Yasmin, to react to that, where he says maybe the way to get there is, the secret is bottom-up peace, he says. After more than 2 decades of working on a single solution for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the establishment of a Palestinian state, it is time to realize that coexistence and peaceful relations will not be obtained through artificial processes imposed on us from above. How viable is an idea of a bottom-up peace process, and what does that even look like anyway?
Naftali Bennett said this?
He did, apparently.
Okay, well, if he's not been taken out of context, and I'm not going to be taken out of context, I agree with him. I think there's a whole lot more potential for coexistence than we recognize. And I think there are what we've had with the separation, with the wall, with Oslo, we've had the separation of two peoples who actually lived among one another. Yes, okay, it was unequal, but there was a lot more coexistence in existence through those periods. Oslo actually separated people out. It put the army the military, the Israeli military, between peoples and communities that hadn't existed before. It's an ironic thing that the peace process actually disaggregated these communities to a greater extent.
Forgive me, Hussein, we often hear about a one-state solution from Palestinians, but there's actually an Israeli version of the one-state solution that former Defense Minister Moshe Ahrens put forward, and let me just have a quote on that, and then I'll put that to you. He says, "What risk are we, meaning Israelis, willing to take? Leave forever large swaths of Judea and Samaria," that's the West Bank, "and uproot tens of thousands of Israelis from their homes, or plan on incorporating into Israel parts of Judea and Samaria and accept the Arab population there as citizens of Israel?" Is that a way forward in your view?
No, of course not. And it's also, that's the point of view that Naftali Bennett shares. But he says exactly the same thing. In fact, he has a detailed plan for annexing all of Area C. That's 60% of the West Bank, not including Jerusalem, that Israel has already annexed. So there is this growing power of annexationist thought in Israeli politics, represented by both of those and many others. Uzi Ariel, the housing minister, is another annexationist. So obviously it's not a way forward, because although this idea has been very appealing to the Israeli right, the expansionist wing of Israel, since 1967, that Israel could either annex all of the occupied territories, or, as both Bennett and Ahrens want, certain convenient parts, leaving other parts, like bits of the West Bank with too many Palestinians in them, like Area A, or Gaza, leaving them to some undefined space, or hoping that somehow you can fob off control onto Jordan or Egypt. This is not possible. What Israel can do unilaterally is to reconstruct the context of the conflict, but it cannot unilaterally end the conflict. And this is a fantasy that's exceptionally dangerous. And I think you've had miniature versions of that in southern Lebanon and in Gaza, where Israel acted unilaterally, and it only produced more conflict. We have a very clear alternate vision where you can contrast that with the peace treaties with Israel and Jordan, which hold, because peace treaties, agreements that are mutual, result in peace. Unilateral actions do not, of course not, because they're taken on behalf of one party for their own convenience. So that's all that will happen. It will just continue the conflict.
Bernard, let me try this with you. The new president of Israel, Reuven Rivlin, also prefers a larger Israel with a larger percentage of Palestinians living within it. Does this idea, in your view, have any traction among non-Likudniks, non-right-wing Israelis?
No, it doesn't. Because Hussein is right about this. All of these sort of hypotheticals are really addressed to the idea that maybe Israel can annex parts of the West Bank where the settlers exist and sort of give up the Palestinian cities to God knows what. I mean, I think the right wing in the country really dreams of all of those Palestinians crossing the river and having a Palestinian state on the other side. I mean, they don't say it out loud. Actually, sometimes they do say it out loud. But I want to come back to something Bennett said about bottom up versus top down, because your first question was about why people are in despair. It's clear that given the fact that each side is fractured and that you have a big moderate majority on both sides, but each side is dealing with radicals that tend to polarize the situation, you have to have an outside force. You have to have international process providing horizons, providing security and diplomatic and economic horizons for the majority so that they can stick together and face down their own radicals. We had hoped that the Kerry/Obama initiative would provide that kind of horizon. The fact that people are in such despair is because that process collapsed, and I think a lot more optimism would be reinfused into this, into both populations, if the American government became much more active again, and in Obama's last 2 years really tried to nail this down, particularly if we have a change in government in Israel, which it's going to be hard to talk about in the time we have left.
No, I understand. And that's, we're not going to know the answer to that question for 4 months anyway. But let's try this.
Right.
Yasmin?
Yes.
One-state solution doesn't seem to be having much traction here. Two-state solution doesn't sound like an option anymore. Why don't we try 3? What about the Jews get Israel, the followers of the Palestinian Authority get the West Bank, and the followers of Hamas get Gaza, and we have 3 states? Is that an option?
I think that's the way it's being run right now, but no, I don't believe that's an option.
Why not?
Well, I don't think Gaza is a state, and I certainly don't think the West Bank is a state. As Bernard was saying, these are really, really interconnected environments and interconnected spaces. It's a really small state, even if we were to combine all three of them. The settlements that now exist in the West Bank region have made the West Bank into this contiguous Swiss cheese state, if you will. It's just not viable. And I don't know why would we want to promote separation? I really do not understand this. Okay, we've got the right wing promoting this sort of bizarre, not even just bizarre, annexation. I don't want to talk about annexation. I want us to be talking about democratization and the processes that move us to democratization and citizenship. Whether we call it one state, two state, or three states, if all Palestinians and Israelis have citizenship rights, we would not then have to designate where someone has to live or can't live.
I appreciate that, but Hussein, if the past 70 years have taught us that Jews and Arabs can't live together in a small part of the world, I'm saying if. Okay,
but
Yasmin,
I
I'm
think it has.
I'm saying
I'm persuaded it has.
Okay, if that's in fact the case, why is a three-state solution where, and in fact you could argue that even followers of the PA and followers of Hamas, who are all Palestinian Arabs, can't live together. In which case, why is a three-state solution not an option?
It's just silly. There's nothing that a three-state solution, so-called, and it's just a bizarre idea, offers that a two-state solution wouldn't. I mean, I do think it's not plausible to imagine equitable power sharing between Israelis and Palestinians in equal numbers in a single state. We had the mandate. Now we've had the occupation. We've had Israelis and Palestinians living together, and we see what happens. It leads to war. It leads to conflict. It's always, inequitable. And I do think some kind of separation. We need some kind of radical solution. We need a revolutionary change from the unjust, brutal, distorting single state that we've had since 1967 and the ticking time bomb single state that was there under the mandate. So I think we can put that aside for a second. And it's, where does this three-state thing come from? Well, it comes precisely from resistance to a two-state solution that wants to point out that there are two competing factions among Palestinians for national power, all right? But that doesn't mean that there are two potential states here. Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank don't see themselves as different. This is not like East and West Pakistan, before the Bengal War.
You could make the case that Tel Aviv should be a state and Jerusalem should be a separate state, given their demographic, demographics. And I mean, I think when you speak about states, obviously, we get wrapped up because we don't think more creatively about states and federal systems and so on. I mean, the three-state solution that I think is reasonable is to see the confederation that I described before, containing Jordan as well.
Yeah,
I mean, the Palestinians are the majority in Amman. They're the real bourgeoisie of Amman. Their wealth and intellectual capital will be fundamental to developing a Palestinian state. So it's almost inconceivable that the Jordanian side of the river and the Israeli side of the river are not going to
more than that, though.
have Palestinians working together.
There's something more than that, which is really important. That Jordan still has a role as the custodian of the Christian and Muslim holy places in Jerusalem. And if it's just an Israeli, Jewish, and Palestinian, Muslim, and Christian arrangement on the holy sites, then it conflates religious and political rivalries. Whereas if you bring the Jordanians in as a third party and have them working with both the Palestinians and the Israelis, you start to, I think, disentangle the religious sentiments and rivalries from the strictly ethno-political one. And I think you get potentially a much more stable triangular arrangement.
Yasmin, let's just tackle this in our last minute or so. I wonder if the momentum is still, in spite of all of its flaws, behind a two-state solution. I ask because we've seen a number of European countries recently vote to create a Palestinian state. We have some 800 Israelis, including famous authors like Amos Oz and David Grossman, signing a petition calling on European nations to recognize Palestine as a state for Arabs. Is the two-state solution still the gold standard here? Okay,
again, if there's a two-state solution wherein Palestinians have full citizenship rights, and they continue to, and within that two-state agreement, Palestinians within the state of Israel also have full citizenship rights, then I could not and would not oppose it. Absolutely not. And whether there's momentum this way or that, I think things change very, very quickly in the region, as we see. I think that on the ground we have support for some sort of resolution. We also, however, and this has not been brought up, we also have support for terrible war. Right?
Yeah.
We have, really, really devastating wars that have occurred in the last several years. So I think this really needs to be taken into consideration. Palestinians have no protection, not state and not international. So for all of this baffle-gab, if I might call it, about the two-state solution and Palestinians having a right to this and that, they don't even have the right of protection under conditions like the Gaza war.
I'm afraid I've got to jump in there because that's our time. I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight here on TVO. Bernard Avishai, the professor of business at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Hussein Ibish, senior fellow with the American Task Force of Palestine out of Washington, D.C. Yasmin Habib, political science professor at the University of Waterloo. It was good of all of you to join us on TVO tonight for this most complicated topic. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.